I think I've kind of come to the conclusion over many years that the primary posture of the church towards the world is and should be that of witness. So after all, it's the thing Jesus said as he ascended to the Father. You will be my witnesses. And it strikes me that the results of the witness, whether that leads to greater popularity or even cultural influence or political power, or whether it leads to persecution and marginalization and being pushed to the edges of culture, well, that's entirely in the hands of God. Our task is to bear witness to Jesus Christ and his coming kingdom in whatever imaginative and courageous and bold and compelling ways that we can.
Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. This is the first episode of our new series on cultural witness. If you're thinking to yourself, I don't even know what cultural witness is, then you're in the right place. To kick things off, we're joined by Bishop Graham Tomlin and Belle Tindall-Riley from the Centre for Cultural Witness based in London, which recently became part of the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity. Graham coined the term cultural witness, and their center has done much thinking about the role of church in society and their place in culture, and what it looks like to be faithful to our calling in these contexts. We discuss how cultural witness relates to things like apologetics and political theology, and the many challenges involved in doing it well. We hope you enjoy listening.
Welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, and Austin and I are here today with Bishop Graham Tomlin. Hi.
Hi, Barney, and hi, Austin. Very good to be with you today.
And also with Belle Tindall-Riley. Hi, Belle.
Hello. I've sort of turned into Graham's sidekick. Wherever he is, there I shall also be.
Well, that's
it's going to be a
fantastic.
double act here.
Yeah. Well, it's a great double act to start our new series in this podcast on cultural witness. And we had to have you guys as the first episode in the series because the term cultural witness, at least I got it from Graham. I don't know, Graham, if you got it from someone else.
No, not particularly. I think it just came to me one day that was kind of a good way of describing what I was thinking and what I was trying to do. So yeah, I think I came up with the idea.
You can claim it.
Well, subliminally, someone may have suggested it to me, and I've kind of forgotten that person. But anyway, there he goes.
Yeah, so I've been very inspired by this idea of cultural witness, inspired enough to do a whole podcast series on it. Now, Graham, you have edited two special issues of journals on the topic of cultural witness with Religions Journal and with International Journal of Systematic Theology. And you also founded the Centre for Cultural Witness, but that no longer exists because it's been merged with the London Institute of Contemporary Christianity. Is that all correct?
That's right. So the idea of cultural witness continues. It's something we want to continue to do and to be engaged with. The Centre for Cultural Witness was a thing to just kind of get that agenda off the ground. So we've now joined with the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, which is an organisation that's quite well known here in the UK, that has been working on the whole faith and culture sort of aspect and, how to relate faith to the whole of life for many years. And so it seemed a natural kind of tie up to kind of join forces and bring together what we were doing. So yeah, that's kind of where we've come to. But with the concept of cultural witness is still very much alive and well and continuing to be explored as we
I'm
speak.
relieved to hear it. So could you just talk through how this whole idea got started? What led you to want to found the Centre for Cultural Witness, and what you thought needed to be done, and what cultural witness is how cultural witness fits that space?
Yeah, thanks, Barney. And I guess it comes out of I suppose the story of my life and faith and ministry so far. I've spent most of my ministry and academic life teaching theology, both in Oxford and in London. And so there's different strands that have led up to this. And one of those strands was the kind of the realization one day that those of us who are theologians, we write our long books on different aspects of, the Christology of Theodore of Mopsuestia or whatever it might be. And basically nobody reads them. Well, a few other theologians read them. Some people in the church reads them. But virtually no one outside the church reads theology. Whereas there's a kind of audience for pretty well every academic discipline, whether that's immunology or biology or psychology or social studies or whatever it might be. There's a kind of application. There's a way in which that body of research finds its way into public life. It's kind of hard to see where theology finds its way into public life. And it struck me that the obvious place for that for the discipline of theology, the fruit of theological work to find its way into public life was in the public witness of the church. And yet so often there seemed to be a disconnect between what theology was doing and the church's public witness. And I suppose, so that was one strand, that kind of observation on the nature of theology. And I remember talking to Miroslav Volf and others about this quite a bit, and he's written a little bit on this as well, how theology needs to find a vocation for itself in public. Another strand, I think, was my life as a bishop. I was a bishop I still am a bishop in the Church of England. Was a kind of working bishop, jobbing bishop for 7 years. I was very conscious of churches in London who were doing their best to share the Christian faith and the love of Christ in practical ways, in verbal ways, doing their social action, their evangelism, their, whatever it might be. But very often in contexts like England, maybe in America as well, it felt like that the attempts to share the faith were falling on rather stony ground. And I'd often think about the parable of the sower and the way the sower goes out to sow the seed, and some falls a different kind, but some falls on quite stony ground where it's hard to get much of a purchase. And it struck me as a little bit like that. And so I began to think, maybe we need to not just do more and more sowing of the seed, more and more alpha courses and more, communications and that kind of thing. But we kind of need to plough up the ground a little more, to prepare the ground for the receiving and the hearing of the Christian gospel.
Oh, that's an interesting image. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the other strand to it, and I think I suppose the third strand was the involvement that I'd had in the kind of public media space. Again, as a bishop, you suddenly realise you've got a bit of a voice. People listen to you because you're the bishop of so and so. I got involved very much in the media aftermath of an event that happened in my area, the Grenfell Tower fire in 2017, which is a sort of major sort of national disaster here in the UK, where 72 people died, and was doing a lot of media interviews around that time. And I often found myself asking the question, okay, what do I say as a Christian leader that is different from what any other community leader would say? How do I not just repeat what everybody else is saying into this? And what do I say how do I talk Christian in this context? And I guess that got me thinking quite a bit about how the Christian voice is heard, and to what extent it draws on the wisdom of the theological tradition. In what case is it, distinct? If I've got 2 or 3 minutes on the radio or on the TV, what do I say that's distinctly Christian?
Well, you put together a team to get going on this project, and one of the first people who joined the team was Belle. Belle, tell me how you got involved, and what led you to be attracted to this project.
Yeah. Well, it started with my career as a bishop, and then as I was listening to Graham, then I was like, oh man, we almost have the opposite story. In that first thing I should say is that Graham plucked me from obscurity. I was in an academic bubble in rural West Wales, where I didn't know
no
one
West
knew
Wales
who I
had
was.
an academic bubble. Sorry, that's rude. That's really rude.
It's a little one, but it is there, I assure you. And I really, thinking about it, I was utterly captivated by biblical studies, by the language and the language the Bible was using to make sense of us, the story it was telling, and all of that. I, of course, myself was a Christian, and yet I do think that I was pushed really into a bubble of only speaking to other Christians and theologians about those things, I think because I was living in that stony soil that Graham was talking about. I'm nearly 30, so I'm a child of that stony soil of new atheism, right? I wasn't massively aware of it, but I grew up in its residue, and so I was terrible. And there is no false modesty in me. I was terrible at speaking about Jesus. to anyone who didn't already have a firm faith in him. I would run from the hills when it looked like an opportunity to do so was about to arise. And so when this Centre for Cultural Witness was sort of bubbling up in London, and I was in, like I say, rural West Wales, something about the vision of it felt very fresh. It felt daunting and terrifying. God really has a quite incredible sense of humour when I think about what I do now in that context.
It didn't sound like you said you're going to run from the hill, run to the hills for any invitation. I don't know quite how you got involved in that case.
Well, this is the thing. I know. I actually, Graham, do you remember this? I came to the interview. So I got an interview. I came to the interview and I said in the interview, I don't want this job and I don't think you should hire me for it anyway. So I'm not kidding.
I had to persuade you, I remember. Yeah.
It really was.
It's a great line. I recommend it if you go for a job. Yeah.
No, it's true. The job I have now, I didn't want.
Yes.
And didn't want when I was interviewed for it. But I think that gives you a sort of extra confidence, doesn't it?
I think it does. And I remember saying to Graham and others on the interview panel, I believe in what you are about to launch so deeply, and I want it so much for my own life as a tool with which I myself can use, that I don't want to ruin it by being a part of it. That genuinely is how I felt. And so all of that to say, that's a long-winded way of saying that as someone who really had no social permission given to her to be a Christian. There was no social permission flying around to seek spiritual answers to spiritual questions. As someone from that context, what Graham was speaking about as some kind of methodology with engaging with culture, with speaking culture's language back to them and doing so in a way that was really engaging and inclusive, just caught me. It just captured me, and it has. I haven't been let go by it. I'm still as captured by that vision as I was on day one. Still as terrified by it as well. So.
That's wonderful. I have to say I resonate a lot with your story there. I remember when I was finishing up my PhD on a French philosopher who nobody had heard of, very deeply immersed in that sort of inner academic discipline. And I did feel like I lost, or perhaps never had, the ability to express some of the things that I learned in the public arena. It was a long sort of journey from that into this feeling like, actually, there are treasures here, but I need to learn the ability to translate those out into the wider world. And it's hard, but you need a forum, you need a venue in which to practice that. And that's exactly what the Centre for Cultural Witness and the Seen and Unseen magazine provides. So, yeah,
both of us, I think, Barney and I, because we, our JRFs after our PhD were supposed to be sort of, engaging with a kind of topic in the culture. And that, I think for both of us, it was so interesting. For me, especially because you were trying to do that while still publishing academic things, but also kind of engaging with the culture. So I was working on, Christian vaccine hesitancy. Barney's working on questions of immigration. And so that sense of like, saying academic things about engaging with the culture and then also engaging with the culture and feeling like I'm not sure how many tools we were given in our education to do that well. In many ways, where this podcast came out of was our sort of sense that this is something that we need to, sort of step into and learn how to do. Yeah.
So thank you both very much for the venue to practice doing that. So can you talk, both of you or either of you, about sort of the main ideas that cultural witness, that the term is trying to get across? What is it that you're trying to do with this centre? And you told me just before here that it's sort of a work in progress figuring out what it means, but I'd love to hear some of that work.
Yeah, well, I guess the two words are both quite important, cultural and witness. I'm just starting with the witness word. I think I've kind of come to the conclusion over many years that the primary posture of the church towards the world is and should be that of witness. There are a number of other competing agendas for what the church ought to be at. For example, some would say the church's job is to wrest the levers of power in the society and kind of, to bend it in a Christian direction. Some would say, the job of the church is to build big churches to kind of, rescue people from the fire or whatever it might be.
Or
But
some
I
people
suppose
might say just social action, right? Just
exactly,
getting on the ground and doing stuff.
Yeah, sort of advancing the kingdom of God or something along those sort of language or whatever it might be. But it strikes me that and there's an element of truth in some of those things, but it seems to me that the primary category for me in terms of the church's posture towards the world is that of witness. After all, it's the thing Jesus said as he ascended to the Father. You will be my, not my apologists, not my lawyers, not my marketing assistants, not my agents, my literary agents, but you'll be my witnesses. And it strikes me that the results of the witness, whether that leads to greater popularity and bigger churches and many people becoming Christians, or even cultural influence or political power, or whether it leads to persecution and marginalization and being pushed to the edges of culture, well, that's entirely in the hands of God. Our task is to bear witness to Jesus Christ and his coming kingdom in whatever imaginative and courageous and bold and compelling ways that we can. So that witness was a kind of theological commitment, if you like, to the importance of witness. But alongside that was the consciousness that witness always takes place in a cultural context. You can never quite entirely abstract the witness from the context in which it's placed. And therefore, in order to give faithful witness, you need to attend to the voice of Jesus Christ, to attend to the gospel as it's always been understood and as it's been handed down to us. But also with another ear, you ought to need to attend to the cultural context in which that witness is given. And therefore, learning a certain cultural literacy is quite important for the church, to be able to read wisely the culture that we're part of, to discern in that culture where you see the signs of the presence of God and the signs of the absence of God, where we push God out of the culture, but yet where God still shows up within sort of cultural artifacts and so on. So I guess it was those two ideas, the predominance, the importance of witness as the church's posture towards the world, but then the kind of importance of the context in which that witness takes place and paying attention, quite careful attention to it, so that we're not uncritical consumers of culture. We are consumers of culture. We can't avoid being that, but we are critical and thoughtful consumers of culture. At a time celebrating the culture that's present, sometimes critiquing it, but always looking for the signs of divine presence within it. But Belle, what do you think?
Yeah, the phrase I always come back to that I find really helpful when it comes to cultural witness in particular is, how does one tell a story that transcends all of time and place in a way that makes particular sense of particular time and particular place? Like how does one do that? And there's a tension in that, and there's a mystery in that, and there's a paradox in that. But I think that's why I find it so fascinating and such a delightful challenge, is that paradox. And like I said, yeah, you mentioned just before we started recording, I said, really, we're building the plane as we're flying it. We've been theologically working out what we mean by this phrase while also having a go, and just like, what a dream job. But and of course, I know, it's just, I mean, in a way that is the sort of the realm we're all in, but I just love it.
It must be fun to be on the sort of on the planning part of it, the very ground, the beginnings of the project, because then you can get to shape it and discern its shape.
Exactly that. And it's, because and we're toying with things and noticing with things and tweaking things and able to be kind of like quite fluid in that way. But that, the word witness and the particular reference to it that Graham brings our attention to in Acts, of course, that is the same word as the word for martyr. And of course, we know martyrs now as people who literally give their lives for, to tell the truth of Jesus, to share the gospel, literally give their lives. And that's it taken to its most literal and logical conclusion. And that is a form of witness. But also there's just this sense in Jesus's words there, in the Greek at least, that a witness is someone who gives their whole self to the story they believe. That literally, like, it's quite an embodied thing, and it's quite a holistic thing to be a witness. And I think if I was to try and tease out the difference between witness and evangelism, it would be that we live the story we tell. And we do so in the way we respond to things and the way we react to things and the way we perceive things and the way So it's this like sort of holistic thing. And then I guess also if we were to try and define what culture is at any given moment, again, like the joy has been sort of toying this out. I've landed, maybe it's temporarily, but on this phrase, it's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and it's the stories we tell each other about each other. That tends to be what culture consists of. And how we tell those stories is through the films we make and the books we write. It's through the policies that we celebrate and the policies we decry. It's through, what we call success and what we call failure, what we champion and what we villainize. Like, we are telling stories through those things, and that we're telling stories to ourselves about ourselves and to each other about each other. And so, like I say, how do we take something as timeless, as transcendent as the gospel, and kind of give it a postcode? Yeah, those are some rough thoughts that I have whirring around.
Yeah, I like this idea of telling the story, or exposing sometimes the stories that we tell ourselves, and then trying to reshape that story in the direction of the sort of Christian overarching story. You mentioned, though, you distinguish between cultural witness and evangelism, and I just wanted to press on that distinction a little bit. And perhaps also with the other word, apologetics, which Graham mentioned earlier. What makes cultural witness different from either of those things?
It's not as binary as perhaps I would make it seem. There's a huge amount of overlap. I think of witness being a bit more holistic, perhaps, because if there's a gap between what we say and how we live, people tend to believe the how we live part.
That is true. Well, absolutely true. Yeah.
I mean, on the most part, unless, I don't know, you're a politician or something. And and so there's that, and we want to bear that in mind. So there's this sense of sort of like integrated authenticity. But I wonder as well, and I'm not a trained evangelist, so evangelists, please like press back on me, as I'm very open about. It's always been a weakness of mine. But I wonder if there's a slightly different start point as well, literally in regard to the conversation we're attempting to have. To do cultural witness, you must be listening attentively to the stories that are being told. Exactly what you've just said. It's about this like stepping back and being like, hang on, what are the stories in the cultural ear, and using those as your start point. So maybe I'm not saying that that's never true of evangelism, but that must always be true of cultural witness. And I wonder if that's a little distinction, perhaps.
And if I can,
there's a lot
just
to pick up on that.
But
Graham, do you want to add your piece? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just so. I mean, Bell's talked very helpfully about the distinction between cultural witness and evangelism. Just to kind of focus on the apologetics side of things for a moment. That Greek word apologia is a good New Testament word. Nothing wrong with it, and we shouldn't be shy of the fact that we are called to make an apologia for our faith, which is if you break that down into those two Greek words, apologia, it's a kind of a word towards. It's a sort of how do we speak, how do we address the culture that we're part of with this logos, with this message, this word of the gospel. And but I guess apologetics in recent times, I think, has largely been determined from the outside, largely, I think, by the new atheism. New atheism suddenly emerged in the 1990s, 2010s as a kind of very aggressive attack on Christian faith. And here were people saying that Christian faith is not just a kind of neutral thing which we can ignore, but a really bad thing which needs to be got rid of, and because it's harmful on kids and children and families and people and so on. And I think the response was a kind of, yes, there is a kind of logic, there's a rationality, and apologetics got into this very rationalist, combative style, which is all about debates with atheist philosophers, and let me give you 10 reasons why God exists after all, and why the resurrection happened, and so on. And maybe it had to do that for a while, but it seems to me that I wonder whether that is the predominant mode of apologetics, which is a kind of rationalistic apologetics. And I suppose what cultural witness is trying to do is something a little bit different, which is what I call a kind of descriptive mode of apologetics, which is trying to describe what the world looks like when you look at it through Christian eyes. What does the world look like when you look at the world of politics or economics or art or science or AI or technology or cost of living crisis or whatever, and you try to look at it through the lens of the Christian gospel? What does that thing look like? Because Christian faith helps you. One way of describing the Christian faith, it's a way of seeing the world. How many of the miracles of Jesus were miracles of the restoring of sight? He enabled people to see again. And part of becoming a Christian is learning how to look at the world with new eyes. To see that individual things are not just things in themselves, but they are signs of something else. And it's sort of giving an account of what's going on in our culture. I guess one of the inspirations behind the idea was I sat down one summer and read through Augustine's City of God, and it struck me that here, if you like, was a kind of work of apologetics. He was trying to give an account of the Roman Empire through the lens of the gospel. How does this empire look like? And maybe it's not the great powerful thing that's going to last forever in the way that everyone thought it was. But actually, when you look at it through the lens of Christian faith, it looks a very different thing. And it struck me, well, that's kind of what we need to do. He did it in this grand way, 1,400 pages or whatever it is. But could we do something like that, looking at the culture we're part of through the lens of Christian faith?
We've probably got about 1,400 pages on the Seen and Unseen magazine by now. I don't know.
Yeah, we're getting there. We are getting there. Yeah, that's right. We've done that many articles. Yeah. So that's kind of what it was. It's not so much let me give you reasons why God exists. Trying to kind of justify Christian faith using perhaps sort of forms of secular logic, but rather let me show you how the world looks and how it's richer and more colourful and more vibrant and makes more sense when you look at it through the lens of Christian faith.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I really love what Belle said about how this cultural witness it's about your whole self, your action and your words being perfectly aligned. And I've had this love-hate relationship to apologetics my whole life. I've been deeply drawn to the idea of finding foundations for faith and expressing those foundations and discussing them and trying to make the faith plausible, but also deeply repelled by what I saw being done in a lot of apologetics scenes, these very aggressive, arrogant arguments which seemed to be devoid of any listening. And to me, it's always felt like even apologetics at its best, the focus is on the Christian beliefs themselves. It's on trying to justify those Christian doctrines. You're looking at the Christian faith, whereas in cultural witness, you're actually looking through the Christian faith. You're using the Christian faith as a lens and saying, can I make better sense of the world around me if I adopt these Christian doctrines as my lens? And that's what I always loved about it. I have very strong opinions about cultural witness, probably too strong for somebody who didn't invent the term. But I was always, I've always, one of my favorite quotes of all time is that C.S. Lewis quote where he says, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And it seems to me that apart from living the Christian life, which Belle, you've talked of as a really important, one of the most persuasive features of Christian doctrine is not whether it is plausible in itself, but whether it helps you understand all of reality better. That's what I love about this idea of cultural witness.
Yeah, I was also, I think along those lines, some of what you've said made me think of, I always have my students read Rowan Williams' essay on theological integrity. And one of the things he says is that, right, a discourse with integrity is one that is sort of open to dialogue, open to challenge. It's not a sort of totalizing discourse. And I think often, apologetics can easily become a totalizing discourse where it's sort of like we have the answers to everything and no one can ever question us. And what I think that cultural witness maybe has a lot of potential for something, right, that has more integrity, that is sort of about bringing this into the culture, but also being sort of open to dialogue, open to some degree to see the Christian faith also from the culture's lens, right? And to see sort of how is this perceived? What is this being offered? And I think that one of the things about that is that it feels risky maybe to people, right? A lot of Christians have kind of been taught like, don't ask questions, this has to be right in every way that you've understood it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe the risk of cultural witness and how that kind of shifts how we position ourselves as Christians in society.
So Graham really had to beat a bad habit out of me when I started writing for Seen and Unseen. Obviously, I'd come from an academic context, and I'm sure you guys can relate. Like when you're putting anything out there, you've done your darndest to make it bulletproof.
Yeah.
Like you've kind of like preempted people's opposition to it and then written a defense into the offense in that kind of way. And so by the time you put it out into the world, you're like, this is watertight. Like, try. And I think I was writing my articles like that, and Graham had to say, you can't do that. That's not, that's not what cultural witness is. Because you're right. There's this. It is at its essence an invitation to come and see. I think that's what cultural witness is, right? And we steal that shamelessly from the Samaritan woman. In John's gospel, come and see. So that means that it's quite an inherently vulnerable task. It has risk. We talk about this idea a lot, that we are not adverts for God at all, like presenting this squeaky clean, bulletproof, doubtless version of ourselves or our faith or our relationship with God. That's not what we are, because gosh, wouldn't we all be terrible adverts for God? I know I would be. But that, and Graham really riffs on this, taking it from Corinthians, I think it is, Graham. Is that right?
Yep. 2 Corinthians
Paul saying, there's it. Paul saying, we are letters from God to the world. And so it's this vulnerability to be able to put ourselves, almost make ourselves a case study sometimes, like sort of point to ourselves in order that we're pointing through ourselves and being those letters as opposed to those adverts. And so you're so right. That's an inherently vulnerable, relatively risky thing to do, and something that invites pushback a lot of the time. So I, for example, and sorry, then I'll hand right over to Graham, but I'm about to release a book called The Sacred Ache, which is all about people who are doing tarot cards and crystals and manifesting their dreams. And I'm trying to do cultural witness in that space. Now, let me tell you.
That's a challenging space.
My gosh, yeah, from every angle. There is not one community for whom like this can be received in a relaxed manner, right? And I just have to be like, this is what it is. This is the task that we're called to. And I think in doing so, and in not being bulletproof or squeaky clean or like tight, I do think we're changing the structures of plausibility for people. I think by being as open as we can and as vulnerable as we can, and of course there's discernment and wisdom needed to everything I'm saying, we are changing the structures of plausibility where people think, well, Graham Tomlin's a person and I'm a person and he has these longings and I have these longings and he has these doubts and I have, do you know what I mean? And I think if we are bleeding our cultural witness of that, it will be bland and pretty ineffective, I think. Sorry, Graham.
Yeah,
put that more succinctly than I just was able to.
No, it's very, very good. And I mean, that phrase "come and see" that Belle focused on, actually, it's one thing that I've learned from Belle a lot as well, because she did her doctorate on John 4 and the kind of story of the woman at the well. And it seems to me that invitation to come and see is both come and see Jesus, come and see a man who told me all that I ever did, but it's also, Jesus enables her to see her life afresh, and tells the story of her life all over again. You've had 4 husbands, and the man you're now with is not your husband, and so on. And so the invitation, there's a kind of double edge to that come and see. It's come and see Jesus, come and get to know this person, but also come and see the way he tells your story differently, and how he tells the story of your culture differently and your world differently, and to come and see through this lens, through these pair of spectacles that are offered to you in the gospel. And I suppose one of the other, you were asking Austin about the risks of cultural witness. I think one of the risks is, we tell ourselves this all the time on Seen and Unseen, that if we get an article in that sounds, well, in our terms in the UK, it sounds like a Guardian editorial or a Daily Telegraph editorial, or in your terms in the US, a Fox News bulletin or a CNN bulletin. And we've probably got it wrong.
Times, yeah.
Exactly, because we've just followed the scripts that are delivered to us all the time by left or right, progressive, conservative, whatever it might be. And we've probably missed the unique voice of Jesus in it. And it strikes me that, Jesus was notoriously difficult to categorize in his day. He wasn't a Herodian, he wasn't a Pharisee, he wasn't a Sadducee, he wasn't a zealot. You couldn't quite pigeonhole him. And therefore the Christian faith, the Christian witness, should be really difficult to pigeonhole. really difficult to categorize in the normal terms of political discourse. And so that's the kind of
hugely
the risk.
Challenging.
It is, exactly. The risk is always to fall into one of those things, because it's quite easy to do. And you can get a lot of clicks and takes by, playing the progressive card or the conservative card or whatever it might be. But actually to get that authentic voice of Jesus speaking into, giving you a fresh take on what's going on around you is, when you get it, it's a precious thing.
Just repeating the culture rather than actually critically reflecting on it. And that's exactly a huge challenge. And I should probably clarify at this point, one of the main things that has been produced by this project is a magazine called seenandunseen.com, strapline Christian perspectives on just about everything. And I've written a few articles on that magazine, and I found that exactly what you said, Graham, extremely challenging. That sometimes I've written something and you've told me, well, that just sounds like you're a wildly left-wing guy criticizing the right, or vice versa. And I've had to tone it down and try and be as non-partisan as possible, and to try and break out of those sort of cultural molds that the culture tries to fit us in and tries to categorize us in. But I also love what Belle, you said about the importance of vulnerability here, about how actually what makes cultural witness different from some modern style of apologetics is just that we make ourselves vulnerable in a way that comes with risk, that can hurt. You're vulnerable, you're earthen jars. Is that what Paul says in 2 Corinthians? Gosh, 2 Corinthians is coming out quite a lot in this episode.
This Paul guy had some stuff to say, didn't he?
That's right.
Even the phrase seen and unseen comes from 2 Corinthians 4. There it is, yeah.
It does. It does.
Oh, I thought it came from the Creed.
Yeah, but the Creed got it from St. Paul.
Got it from,
Oh, okay. Well, so you don't have to pit the Creed against the Bible. That's good to know. Yeah, I believe in all things. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of all things, visible and invisible, or seen and unseen.
Yeah, which picks up a line from St. Paul where he talks about, what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal, which is kind of the other way around that we normally think. We normally think what we can see and feel and touch, that's the kind of solid stuff we can rely on, whereas the unseen stuff, God and prayer, that's all a bit vague and impossible, so we can just forget about that. But as he says the other way around, you see the seen in the light of the eternal unseen. So,
it is very Platonic, as we were talking about just beforehand. It's pure Plato, that verse in Paul. Sorry to have to say so.
N.T. Wright would hate it, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Can I pick up really quickly on something you just said, Barney, because it's really helpful. This idea of you writing something that felt like this relaxes left or relaxes right. I don't know, just with everyone I speak to, this idea that we as Christians would be quite public and, let's use that word again, vulnerable about the fact that there is friction within us when it comes to political scripts. Just saying that, I have found people be so literally sigh with relief. Do you know what I mean? We have a message, and the message is that there should be friction within you when it comes to your moral outlet, your political outlet. Religious or not, be wary of anyone that tells you everything you want to hear and nothing of what you don't. Do you know, there's a warning there about having a frictionless life and living in echo chambers. And so I sometimes think that even Christians saying that is in itself a refreshing form of cultural witness, that we would say we don't fit neatly here or there. And that's vulnerable, but that's where we are. I think that in itself is super effective.
Yeah, and that because part of what you're giving people is a different way of thinking really about what it means to be human, right? What it means to believe things, because what they're being told is ideologies exist so that you can hold together a coalition of special interest groups so that you can hold power, and those have to be unquestionable, and so this is also a way of saying the things you believe about the world aren't about agreeing with a group of people so that you can have power over other people. This is about sort of seeing reality for what it is and honoring it, and I think just holding that line, which is very difficult because everyone wants to say, yeah, but you're doing that for one of these political parties, and even if you're very much not, they want to hear it that way, right? Which I think is that challenge that Graham named, is that how is this going to be perceived and how can we help it be seen differently, which takes a lot of creativity, right? Which I think has come up again and again. The immense creativity that it takes, I think, to do this well is a real kind of challenge and calling, I think.
Beautifully put. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly.
Now, how would you characterize the end goal of all of this? What would look like success in like 10 years' time, for example, if with all of these efforts and all of this work?
Yeah, well, it's always the story of the last few years has been fascinating for us, because I remember when I originally sort of started pitching the idea of cultural witness and the Centre for Cultural Witness, I would give my sort of stump speech, which was something along these lines, that, that in regular discourse in media, you very rarely hear the Christian voice. If you do, it's either shrill and kind of a bit angry, or it's just you don't hear it, it's silent, or it's scattered. You hear it, but you really have to look hard for it. And we need to really strengthen the Christian voice in public, and going to get really thoughtful, intelligent Christian voices into public life. And one of the interesting things is, over the last 3 years, that has changed quite significantly here in the UK, because everybody's talking about religion now, for good and bad reasons. For good reasons. That
not sure we can take full credit for that, though. It just seems to have happened all by itself.
I'm not.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. Well, I was going to go on to say I'm not taking credit for this because I've seen unseen, but but it's actually kind of watching it happen, that because of stories of choir revivals, and whether they happen or not is another question, but you hear of public figures, certainly here in the UK, declaring their faith that they have, and that seems to happen on a regular basis. Politically, Christianity has become big news, because it's been, well, depending how you put it, has it been co-opted? Has it been adopted, by certainly on the kind of right wing of politics, both here in the UK and in the US. And so therefore it's a kind of topical issue. And so it's kind of there on the agenda of, for people. People are talking about religion and faith and Christianity in a way that they probably weren't 3 or 4 years ago. And so I suppose in that context, what Cultural Witness is trying to do, I think, is to bring the wisdom of the Christian tradition to bear on that conversation in such a way that makes people, well, put it this way, one of the phrases we often use is a phrase that Blaise Pascal used in his Pensée. And as you may know, I've written a biography of Blaise Pascal, which came out last year.
It's your latest book, yes, a book on Blaise Pascal.
Yeah, that's right. And that was largely stimulated by, well, I mean, I'd done a lot of work on Pascal before, but as we were starting the Centre for Cultural Witness, this was the time to write the biography of Pascal, who I think is one of the great cultural witnesses of the last few centuries. But he had this phrase where he said, when you're trying to commend Christian faith, make it attractive, make good people wish it was true, and then show that it is. And I think that step he puts his finger upon, make people wish it was true. That's, I think, the goal of Cultural Witness. It's not necessarily to convince them logically that it is true, but it's to bring them to the point where they somehow think there's something about this thing that, even though I don't believe it, I wish I could, or I wish that it was true. Because Pascal's point is, if you can get someone to that point, or if you can get a culture to that point, showing the kind of coherence and sort of the Christian faith, it's not that hard, actually. The hard thing is the heart, because actually that's where our key decisions are made. And that's what, Pascal, it's quite an extensive discussion of the nature of the heart as the organ for knowing God as opposed to the reason. By heart, he means not, emotion, romantic feelings, but a kind of deep, profound spiritual, intellectual instinct. So I think the goal of Cultural Witness is making people wish it was true, putting it that way. And that involves both verbal witness, the kind of witness Belle is talking about in terms of sort of vulnerability, the whole of one's life, being a witness to Christ. That's, I think, where it goes.
But that's also why you end up saying not this is why Christianity is true in the sort of apologetics style, but rather saying from a Christian perspective, this is how we would understand, medicine, politics, economics, art, and all of these different things. And you just keep saying, from a Christian perspective, this is what we would say, without ever trying to justify or defend that Christian perspective. Instead, you're just showing it. That's the come and see element, isn't it?
Yeah, we had a conversation. We run a course for young Christian writers here in the UK, and we had James K.A. Smith on a call a few weeks ago, And he made the point really well. He said, I'm just not interested in apologetics, but I am interested in being unapologetic about my faith. And I thought that captured it very well. We're not trying to do apologetics in the sense of here are all kinds of reasons why you should believe it. But I'm being pretty unapologetic about my Christian faith. I'm taking that as my standpoint. That is the way I look at the world. And let me show you what the world looks like when I look at it in this unapologetically Christian way. So we're not trying to build an apology for Christian faith. We're trying to say, well, actually, when you look at the world through this lens, this is what it looks like. Like you were saying, Barney, you're not looking at Christian doctrines, you're looking through them and helping people to see how the Christian faith makes so much sense of the world, or makes a different sense of the world than what you normally think of.
And I guess that's not to say that there's no role for justifying the Christian doctrines. Once people have got to the point where they wish it's true, as you say, when they're attracted and compelled by the Christian faith, they might have different questions that are more the sort of classical apologetic style, and that's the time to do them. But it has to be done after they've already been compelled. They've already seen the beauty and the attractiveness of being a Christian in the first place.
It also strikes me that, Christianity still has a lot of cultural power, even if it's not always sort of that front and center in the culture. And there's a lot to be said for a strong cultural witness that just like that people have encountered something that is faithful and dignifying, that is being Christian, so that when it's being co-opted for other things, they can sort of see that for what it is. It seems like we've had all these points in history where, Christianity is sort of grasped as this really kind of evil, powerful thing. And people just think, oh, okay, Christianity's bad. And I think there's so much behind, what you guys are doing, for instance, that, so many people are going to think, well, I'm not sure that is Christian, right? What does that have to do with this? Which I just think there's a lot to be said for that as an important outcome of this.
Well, it's challenging though. And one of the big challenges I've had trying to write for the Seen and Unseen magazine is that so much of my thinking about Christianity, it turns out, is addressing other Christians. I found I kept wanting to write something that was like, you Christians should realize this rather than that, or whatever. I should try and direct and instruct the faithful. And it was a huge challenge to step out of that mentality and say, no, I'm addressing non-Christians from a Christian point of view. It's a completely different genre. I don't know, did you guys find that a challenge to begin with when you started it?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. I think I didn't, but because I think I had a different start point where I was desperate for someone to tell me how to engage with my friends who weren't Christians about my Christian, that's what I was missing. I was no good at it. That's what I was hankering for. And so I didn't struggle with it in that way. I'm sure I do. And I'm sure I have blind spots. I know that I do. But you're right. It's a very particular niche. When it comes to writing for Seen and Unseen. But I don't know if you find this, Barney, it's quite addictive. It's quite an addictive substance. Once you've got the knack for it, I struggle to write for Christians now. I really do. I struggle to use shorthands. I struggle, I had this conversation with someone once, and I've written about this and spoken about this, but he asked me what the love of God feels like. He wasn't a Christian. And he was just like, what does the love of God feel like? I struggle now to not every time I say the love of God, try and make an explanation for what it feels like. It's quite intoxicating.
Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think some of the best resources for Christians emerge from that space, right? If you think of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, that was addressed to non-Christians, but Christians love reading it and benefit a lot from it. Yeah. But it does, the thing that I struggled with, I guess, points to a different challenge, which is the challenge of, is there a one unified Christian perspective on everything? Obviously, the culture is well aware that Christians don't always agree on, and sometimes violently disagree on a lot of things, even in the political realm. And so can you talk a little bit about the challenge of navigating the space in which Christians disagree with each other when trying to present this cultural witness to the world?
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, Barney, you referenced earlier on a little tagline that we've always put on the top of the website, which is Christian perspectives on just about everything. And that was quite carefully chosen, really, because it was not the Christian perspective on just about everything, as if we have one and we can say what it is. And it's not Christian perspectives on everything, but it's just about everything. We're not going to be able to cover everything on the site. We're going to just be able to kind of do, a lot of different topics, but we're not trying to say the last word on anything on it. And so there's a sort of, hopefully a bit of modesty built into that. But also a sense that, yes, we are going to provide a range of Christian perspectives on things. And there are going to be topics where we actually offer some quite different perspectives on it. So, for example, reparations for slavery. Should Christians, should churches or bodies in the present kind of apologize for past actions of their ancestors and attach financial resources to that, which is my own church, the Church of England, has done. And now we published an article by someone saying this was a very good idea. This is exactly what the church should do. And someone saying, it's a thoroughly bad idea. There's this, if the current generation's got no responsibility for previous ones. Both of them still writing to our number one rule: always write for the person outside the church, don't write for the Christian. But it was an issue that was exercising a lot of people in kind of wider society as well. It's not just an issue for Christians. We're embarking on a project which I know you've done quite a lot of thinking on in Faith at the Frontiers, on the whole relationship between church and the nation and how those two are related to each other. And we're commissioning our series of about a dozen articles by key Christian thinkers that will encompass quite a range of perspectives on that. Some who are quite keen on the idea of some kind of Christian nationalism, some who are very opposed to it. And, we want to try to bring them into conversation with each other. And that's part of the witness. The part of the witness is that Christians don't always agree on stuff. But we want to go back to the same source. We want to go back to the teaching of Jesus. We want to go back to the scriptures and wrestle with that to try to make sense of our world. And so therefore part of the witness sometimes will be that vulnerable place of saying, actually, Christians don't always agree on stuff. They disagree quite violently on it. But can we find some way of bringing those perspectives into conversation rather than having them fight it out, in public together? But
I guess it's about inviting non-Christians into that debate that takes place among Christians, and that's part of the vulnerability to it as well. It's like we haven't got all of this worked it out, but join with us in thinking this
exactly
through.
And which is part of the invitation to become a Christian is not an invitation to a set of ideas that will tell you exactly what you need to think about everything. It's an invitation into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, which will begin to transform the way you look at the world. And people will, some people will end up on the right, some people will end up on the left, and that's okay. But you still have this common core of things you're working from, and to help to navigate those conversations. I think that's a more honest way of inviting people into Christian faith than saying,
I guess the other thing that's honest, like the other thing that you need to be honest about is this is what all Christians tend to agree on versus this is my own opinion within that. Rather than presenting your own views as if they were the whole of Christianity.
Mm-hmm. And seeing part of the witness is Christianity at its best. Also, the Christian tradition gives us a framework to disagree well about things. Right. I think we have a calling actually to disagree better than our culture often does. And it's, I think, a good thing to sort of practice and try to live up to that calling a little bit. That could be, I think, a really powerful thing to offer the rest of culture.
Yeah, that public wrestling, I think. Someone at Chinny MacDonald, I'm stealing this from here. She speaks a lot about, she's like, the thing we need to do more than anything else in regards, like in the public square,
we're going to interview her in a few episodes' time. So.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
She's wonderful, and I really hang on to hit every word when it comes to some of these topics. She's like public Bible study. I mean, obviously not using that phrase because who on earth would be interested in that? But I mean, us forward. But like this public wrestling of being vulnerable, of showing our disagreement, of thrashing it out with each other, and exactly like you've said, Austin, of showing that there's a healthy model to do that. Again, it comes back to this idea of like a frictionless life is not a fruitful one. There is such thing as healthy friction, and who better to model that than Christians really thrashing out some of the details of what we believe about the world. Yeah, I mean, I'm not brave enough to do it, but all power to those who are. Go on, Chinny.
That's right. That's why Barney and I sometimes stage debates on the podcast. We need to do more of those.
Ooh.
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that was, it felt very vulnerable, actually, especially because we weren't always taking positions that we ourselves held, but we just wanted to put forward these different points of view. And we staged a debate on Christian nationalism, which...
Wow.
I remember listening to it. It was very good.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Did a great job.
Did you have any concluding insights or thoughts?
Yeah, I suppose it's just a thought is, maybe to just give one or two examples of how this works. And we had a debate. We have a little editorial meeting every now and again where we sort of just pool ideas and think about what we might want to write about or commission or whatever. And we were thinking about the whole Jeffrey Epstein story, I think it was Belle. You were saying something about how frustrated you were with the debate on it. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I was getting more and more frustrated with the language being used, the adjectives in particular being used to speak of these actions. Things like corrupt, immoral, unwise. Just none of it felt like it was even scratching at the truth. It all felt so hollowed out, like it just wasn't even coming close to adequate language. So yeah, I came with that frustration of being like, it feels like we're kind of like in this swill of sanitized nothingness, that's keeping us away from any form of justice. I'm a really cheery colleague.
So anyway, we had this conversation, and Belle was making this comment, and we thought, okay, well, what does Christian faith, how can Christian faith help you understand what's going on in the Jeffrey Epstein story? And we hit on the idea of sin. What might the idea of sin do to help you read what's happening in the Jeffrey Epstein story? So we actually commissioned one of our writers, a guy called Johnny Torrance, who'd done a doctorate on Luther's doctrine of sin, and we said to him, would you want to write a piece on Jeffrey Epstein and how the doctrine of sin helps you understand this? And he wrote this brilliant little piece. I think it's simply called "Why Do You Need the Idea of Sin to Understand Jeffrey Epstein?" And he wrote about how Christians write about sin, about how sin is this. It's not just individual acts that we do, but it's a power. It's a kind of power that is seductive, and it draws you in, and it kind of overwhelms you, and it's a very attractive thing. And you can see how it began to draw people into this sort of nexus of power that was there. But also that sin is a kind of misdirected love. It's a misdirected. It's a good instinct that is misdirected towards something wrong. And then he developed these ideas in a way that suddenly made you see what was going on in the Jeffrey Epstein story in a whole new light, and made greater sense of it. And rather than that hollowed out thing about who's guilty and who isn't, and there's the bad people over there who had something to do with Jeffrey Epstein, and the good people over here who had nothing to do with him. It drew us all into that story, that there's an element of that sin inside all of us. We can recognize it in the Jeffrey Epstein story, but you can see it concentrated there. And it was a great example, I thought, of drawing on the kind of wealth of Christian faith and Christian theology, looking at a contemporary story through the lens of that particular Christian doctrine and Christian idea, in a way that helped you see that story in a whole new light and gave it a depth and a wisdom that you couldn't find it. It was just a really good example to me of the kind of thing we're trying to do on Seen and Unseen. Don't always get it right, but hopefully seenandunseen.com and the podcast that Belle does, Re-Enchanting, on it, is an example of those very things. So it was just a little example of that.
That is a great example. And I guess another example would be, Belle, what you're aiming to do in your book. I thought I could let you plug it as in a final word.
Oh, yeah. Barney, you're so kind. Yes, I wrote a book called The Sacred Ache, and it really is both about and to people who would call themselves spiritual but not religious. So people using spiritual practices as a new form of self-help. And it tries to excavate. Oh, there it is. Graham's holding it up.
There it is.
Exhibit A.
It's a very good book. You must read it. Excellent.
Ooh, cool.
Oh, that's very kind. I mean, it tries to excavate the longings, the yearnings, the aches, right? The sacred aches that are driving people to do these practices. that I argue in my book are true, good, innate, God-designed. And then I basically do this come and see approach where I'm like, I have all of those yearnings, those longings, those desires. Here's where I go with them. It's always Jesus, so it gets quite predictable by the end. But it's, it is.
How and why and in what way it's Jesus is the interesting bit, huh?
Exactly. So that's my latest and definitely most vulnerable piece of cultural witness. So we'll see how it goes.
I'm very excited to look at it. We'll put a link to that in the podcast text.
Yeah.
So
that is
thanks
kind.
very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for your time and for sharing these rich insights. It's been a really wonderful conversation.
Thanks very much indeed.
It's been a joy.
Great
Thank
to
you.
be with you, Barney and Austin. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.